The night was quiet when Sundar Pichai's car rolled slowly through the narrow road outside the city. The street lamps flickered weakly, throwing shadows across the cracked pavement. It was not the kind of place where you would expect to find the CEO of Google, but Sundar had always believed that some of the most important lessons in life came from the most ordinary corners of the world. He had just finished visiting a small community center he quietly supported, a place where children from struggling families could learn coding, math, and English for free. He never made announcements about these visits, never brought cameras, never wanted headlines. To him, kindness meant more when it was unseen. Yet as his car turned past an abandoned factory, flashing red and blue lights suddenly exploded in the rearview mirror. A police car swerved sharply and blocked the road ahead. Sundar's driver, startled, braked hard. Another vehicle pulled up behind them, boxing them in. The silence of the night was gone, replaced by the sharp crackle of radios and the heavy footsteps of officers approaching from both sides. "Step out of the car." A stern voice barked. The driver hesitated, unsure, but Sundar gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly. With calm dignity, Sundar opened his door and stepped into the cool air. The officers looked tense, their hands near their holsters. Their eyes flicked to the sleek black car, then to Sundar himself. He was dressed simply plain shirt, jacket, nothing that screamed wealth or power. To them, he looked like an ordinary man in an expensive vehicle that might not belong to him. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," one officer said, his tone sharp, almost suspicious. Sundar nodded. "Of course. May I know what this is about?" But the officer didn't answer. Instead, he motioned to another, who stepped forward with a flashlight and began peering into the car. The light swept over the leather seats, the briefcase near Sundar's feet, the papers on the dashboard. Sundar could feel the tension growing thicker. Though he remained calm, what the officers didn't know is that in that briefcase lay something unusual. Not money, not anything illegal, but something personal, something that would raise questions the moment it was seen. Sundar's hand twitched slightly as he thought about it, not because he was afraid of being guilty, but because he understood how easily people judged without knowing the full story. The officer with the flashlight narrowed his eyes. "Whose car is this?" "Mine," Sundar replied gently, though the officer's doubtful look showed he didn't believe him. Another officer muttered, "We've had reports about suspicious vehicles in this area. Need to check everything." Before Sundar could respond, one officer pulled open the back door and saw the briefcase. He reached for it immediately. Sundar's driver tried to protest, but Sundar stopped him with a calm gesture. The officer placed the briefcase on the hood of the car and snapped it open. Inside, neatly stacked, were old photographs, yellowed at the edges, along with a small, worn-out box wrapped carefully in cloth. The officers exchanged confused glances. "What's this?" one asked, lifting the box. Sundar's eyes softened. "That belonged to my father," he said quietly, but the officer wasn't moved by sentiment. He set the box down and flipped through the photographs. He stopped at one in particular. It showed Sundar as a boy, barefoot, standing outside a tiny house in India, holding his mother's hand. There was no mistaking the struggle etched in the faded picture. Yet, instead of empathy, suspicion clouded the officer's face. "Why are you carrying this around?" "Looks strange to me," he said coldly. Sundar felt a sting of judgment, but he answered calmly, "Because it reminds me of where I came from." The driver glanced nervously at Sundar, as if asking whether he should call someone, but Sundar shook his head. His calmness was not weakness. It was a shield. Still, the officers weren't satisfied. "We'll need to take you in for questioning." The senior one finally declared. The driver gasped, but Sundar simply nodded, as though he had expected this. He knew that sometimes life tested you when you least expected it. The officers placed the briefcase back into the car, but they kept the small wrapped box in their possession. They didn't know what was inside, and their curiosity mixed with suspicion made them uneasy. As they escorted Sundar to the police vehicle, one of them whispered to another, If this guy's story doesn't add up, we're going to have a big case on our hands. Sundar heard the words, but he didn't react. Instead, his mind wandered briefly to the box. Inside, it was not money, not jewels, not secrets of power, but something deeply personal that told the story of his entire life. He feared not for himself, but for how easily truth could be twisted when people refused to see with compassion. The ride to the station was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Sundar looked out the window at the city lights, his mind reflecting on his journey. He thought of his childhood, the nights when electricity failed in Chennai, when his family studied by the weak glow of kerosene lamps. He thought of his father saving money for years to buy him a ticket to America, believing in a dream even when it seemed impossible. Those memories were heavier than any suspicion. When they reached the station, the air was thick with chatter and the smell of stale coffee. Officers watched as Sundar was led in, some curious, some dismissive. He was asked to sit at a metal desk under a harsh fluorescent light. Across from him, an officer began writing notes. Name? Sundar Pichai, he replied softly. The officer froze, pen hovering over paper. The room grew quieter. A few younger officers nearby exchanged glances. The name sounded familiar, almost impossible. One whispered, "Did he just say Sundar Pichai? Like Google?" But the senior officer brushed it off. "Lots of people with the same name," he said firmly. The questioning began where he had been, why he was carrying those items, what was in the box. Sundar answered each question with honesty, his voice steady, never defensive. Yet the officers pressed harder, their doubts louder than reason. Then came the moment that shifted the air in the room. One officer unwrapped the cloth around the box and opened it slowly. Inside was something unexpected, a simple, rusted key attached to a faded tag with writing in Tamil, his mother tongue. Beneath it lay a folded letter, fragile with age. The officer frowned, clearly confused. A key to what? He asked. Sundar single quotes, S eyes fixed on the key, his heart heavy. "To the house where I grew up," he said softly. The officers stared at him, stunned by the simplicity of the answer. But before anyone could speak, the door to the room swung open, and a man hurried in, holding his phone. "Sir, you're not going to believe this," he said breathlessly to the senior officer. "Do you know who this man really is?" "The senior officer frowned. "What are you talking about?" The younger officer turned the phone screen toward him. The glow revealed a news photo of Sundar standing on a global stage, speaking at a conference. His face unmistakable. The senior officer's expression faltered, his certainty cracking. He looked at Sundar again, suddenly realizing the weight of the mistake. But before he could say anything, a call rang loudly on the station phone. The officer who picked it up listened, then turned pale. He handed the receiver to the senior officer. The voice on the other end was firm, urgent, and filled with authority. "Release him immediately," the voice commanded. The senior officer swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly as he held the phone. The room was frozen, every eye on Sundar, who sat calmly, quietly, waiting. And in that silence, as the officers stood stunned, nobody yet realized that the discovery of the small key in the box would lead to something far bigger than any of them could imagine. The room was still. Every officer frozen in place as the senior officer lowered the phone with a stiff hand. The weight of the command he had just received pressed down on him like a heavy stone. Sundar sat across the table in silence, his calm expression unshaken by the chaos around him. He did not gloat, he did not show anger, he simply waited. In that silence, even the hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder, filling the air with an uneasy tension. The younger officers, now realizing the truth of who stood before them, began whispering among themselves. The name that had once sounded like coincidence now struck them with full force. Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google, a man whose decisions shaped the digital lives of billions, was sitting at their interrogation table as if he were just another suspect dragged in from the street. The irony hung in the air, sharp and almost painful. The senior officer cleared his throat and tried to regain control. "Mr. Pichai," he began, his voice hesitant. There appears to have been some misunderstanding. His eyes flickered nervously to the open box on the table, where the rusted key and fragile letter rested under the harsh light. Sundar's eyes remained on the key, his gaze distant, almost as if he were seeing not the object but the memory it carried. He spoke. Softly, his words calm yet weighted with emotion. Misunderstandings happen, but sometimes they reveal things we are meant to face. The senior officer shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. He wanted to close the box, to put away the strange contents, but something about Sundar's tone stopped him. The letter looked fragile, like it could crumble with the slightest touch, and yet it seemed to radiate a quiet power. One of the younger officers, unable to resist, reached forward and unfolded the letter with delicate care. The handwriting was shaky, faded with time, written in Tamil. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. Sir, this looks old. Really old, he said. Sundar leaned forward slightly, his eyes softening as they fell on the letter. That was written by my mother, he explained. His voice trembled, just slightly, breaking through the calm surface he had maintained until now. The room grew quieter still. The officers who had moments ago treated him with suspicion now looked on with something closer to respect. The younger one asked cautiously, "What does it say?" Sundar hesitated, as though the words were too private, too sacred to speak aloud in this setting. But then he took a deep breath. It says, "Never forget where you came from, and never forget who you are. Even if the world tries to tell you otherwise." She wrote it when I was leaving for America all those years ago. She gave me the key with the letter and told me that no matter what happened, I would always have a door back home. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier suspicion now seemed foolish, almost shameful, in the face of something so deeply human. But before any apology could be spoken, the station door burst open again. Another officer hurried in, his face pale, holding a sheet of paper he had just printed. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, thrusting the paper into the senior officer's hands. The senior officer glanced down, his eyes widening. It was a security bulletin from another precinct, reporting a string of robberies involving fake officers and stolen identities. The bulletin mentioned vehicles similar to Sundar's, operating in the same area. Suddenly, the senior officer realized why his team had been so tense earlier. They thought they were preventing a crime. Instead, they had stumbled into something far more complicated. The younger officer looked at Sundar with newfound unease. "Sir, I think this key, it might not only be about your past. Maybe someone else was after it." Sundar's brow furrowed slightly. He had carried the key for decades, never imagining it could be of interest to anyone but himself. To him, it was a personal relic, a symbol of his roots. But now, as he looked at the faces around him, he sensed a larger story was beginning to unfold, one he had not prepared for. The senior officer, trying to cover his earlier arrogance with professionalism, cleared his throat again. "Mr. Pichai, I believe you may be in danger. And whatever is connected to that key, it may involve more than personal memories." Sundar studied the officer's expression carefully. He could see the shift what had begun as suspicion was, now turning into responsibility and maybe even guilt. But Sundar did not dwell on blame. Instead, he spoke with quiet resolve. "Then we must find out what this is truly about." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the younger officer, the same one who had unfolded the letter, asked gently, "Would you allow us to escort you back to your car? I think we owe you more than an apology." Sundar rose slowly from his chair. "You owe me nothing," he replied softly. "But you owe yourselves the courage to see people beyond appearances." His words struck the room with quiet force, making several officers bow their heads. Outside the station, the night was colder now, a light drizzle falling. From the sky, the streetlights reflected against the wet ground, turning the city into a blur of colors. Sundar's car waited, the driver standing nervously beside it. As Sundar approached, he noticed the briefcase still in the back seat, untouched. But his eyes were fixed on the small rusted key, now safely back in his pocket. The officers followed him outside, awkward in their silence. The senior officer finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Mr. Pichai, if you don't mind, could you tell us what that key opens? Why is it so important?" Sundar paused by the car door. His hand rested lightly on the handle, but he didn't open it yet. Instead, he looked up at the rainy night sky, his eyes distant. "It opens more than a door," he said softly. "It opens memories that remind me who I am. And perhaps it opens questions that even I do not yet understand." The words left the officers unsettled, almost haunted. Before they could respond, Sundar got into the car. The driver closed the door and started the engine, pulling slowly away from the station. The officers stood watching, their minds heavy with questions inside. The car, Sundar sat quietly, staring at the raindrops sliding down the window. The key in his pocket felt heavier than ever before, as though it carried not just his past but a mystery waiting to be revealed. His thoughts drifted to his childhood home in Chennai, the cramped rooms, the scent of his mother's cooking, the laughter of neighbors carried through thin walls. That key was the only link left to those days. Yet now, someone else seemed to care about it. As the car moved deeper into the city, Sundar's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated, then opened it. The text was brief, chilling in its simplicity. "We know what you carry. The past will not stay hidden." Sundar's heart skipped a beat. His eyes hardened, the calm surface, giving way to quiet determination. He did not show the driver the message. He simply closed his phone and slipped it back into his jacket. The night outside seemed darker now, the drizzle turning to heavy rain. Sundar leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He knew this was no longer just about a key. It was about a truth buried so deep that even he had tried to forget it. But now someone else wanted to dig it up, and as the car turned onto the main road, Sundar realized that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The rain poured harder as Sundar's car rolled through the dark streets. Each drop struck the windshield like a warning, a reminder that the night was far from ordinary. Sundar sat in silence, his thoughts circling around the short, cryptic message that had arrived moments ago. "We know what you carry. The past will not stay hidden." It replayed in his mind again and again, each word heavier than the last. The driver glanced at him nervously through the rearview mirror, sensing the tension. Sundar gave a small reassuring nod, but inside he was unsettled. For years he had carried the rusted key and the fragile letter as personal relics, symbols of humility and memory. They were never meant to attract attention, never meant to become part of anyone else's story. And yet now someone else was watching, someone who seemed to know more than they should. His mind drifted back to his childhood in Chennai. He remembered the tiny apartment, the peeling paint on the walls, and the faint hum of ceiling fans that often stopped when electricity failed. The key had always been kept in a small drawer by his father's bed. He could still picture the careful way his father would touch it, as if it held something sacred. Sundar never understood why until the day he was leaving for America. That was when his mother placed the key in his palm, pressing it firmly, whispering words he never forgot. "This is not just a key. It is our story." As a memory faded, present returned with sharp clarity. Sundar leaned forward and quietly told the driver to change direction. Instead of heading home, he wanted to go somewhere else, somewhere private. The driver obeyed without question, turning the car toward a quiet neighborhood where the noise of the city seemed to vanish. They stopped near an old library, closed and empty at this hour. Sundar stepped out, the rain soaking his jacket instantly. He walked beneath the dim light of a flickering street lamp, pulling the key from his pocket. He held it in his hand, staring at it as the water streamed down his face. There was nothing extraordinary about it to the eye, just rust and the faded tag, but Sundar could feel the weight of its history pressing against him. The driver hurried after him, worried. "Sir, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice shaky. Sundar gave a faint smile. "Sometimes the past does not leave us alone," he replied softly. Before the driver could respond, Sundar's phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown appeared on the screen. This time, the words were even more unsettling. If you want to protect what the key unlocks, meet us where it all began. Sundar froze. His heart thudded against his chest. Where it all began. The phrase was simple, but he knew exactly what it meant. It was not a riddle. It was his childhood home in Chennai, the very place the key belonged. He stood there in the rain, the driver watching him with concern, and he felt the clash of two worlds. On one side was the life he lived now, meetings with leaders. Technology shaping billions of lives, responsibilities stretching across continents. On the other side was the small boy he once was, barefoot on dusty roads, holding his mother's hand as she reminded him that true worth came from humility, not wealth. And between them stood the key, connecting both worlds in ways he was only beginning to understand. Back in the car, Sundar sat silently, staring at the rain streaks on the glass. The driver finally gathered the courage to ask, "Sir, who is sending these messages? Should I call security?" Sundar shook his head gently. "No. If I bring more people into this, it may only grow more dangerous. This is something I must face myself." His words carried the weight of decision, but deep inside, fear gnawed at him. Not fear for his safety, but fear of what he might uncover. What if the past held something darker than he had imagined? What if his family story was not as simple as he believed? The car drove through the night until they reached Sundar's home. Inside, he went straight to his study and placed the key on his desk. The room was filled with books, papers, and quiet order, yet the small rusted object seemed to dominate the space. Sundar sat in the chair, his fingers tracing the faded tag, reading the Tamil letters written by his mother long ago. He opened his laptop, searching through old archives he had digitized years earlier. Photographs of his family appeared, his father smiling beside an old scooter, his mother cooking in their modest kitchen, himself as a young boy with dreams too big for the space he lived in. He scrolled until he found an old document about the neighborhood he grew up in, the narrow lane where their home once stood. Most of it had changed, rebuilt into shops and apartments. But one corner remained untouched, the place, his key still, belonged to Dot. The rain outside grew heavier, thunder rumbling in the distance. Sundar leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing against him. Just as his eyes began to close, his phone buzzed once more. Another message lit up the screen. This time, it was a picture. His breath caught as he opened it. The photo showed the old lane in Chennai, his childhood home faintly visible in the background. Standing in front of it was a shadowy figure holding a sign. The words written on it were chilling. "Come back before it is too late." Sundar's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the phone. Someone had been there. Someone had stood in front of the very house he had left decades ago. And now they were calling him back. He stared at the key on the desk, its rusted surface glistening under the dim light. His heart pounded as a realization grew inside him. This was no longer just about memory or sentiment. This was about a truth buried in that house. A truth someone else wanted to uncover or destroy. And in that moment, Sundar knew one thing. With absolute certainty, he had to return to India. The decision to return to India weighed heavily on Sundar. But once it was made, he moved quickly. The night after the chilling photo arrived, he informed his closest aide that he needed a short leave of absence. He gave no explanation, only a gentle request for privacy. Those around him respected his quiet nature. The whispers soon began. Why? Would the CEO of one of the world's largest companies suddenly vanish without warning? Sundar ignored the murmurs. He knew this was something no one else could understand, something no one else could face for him. 2 days later, he stepped off a plane into the humid air of Chennai. The familiar scent of the city's spices, sea breeze, and dust hit him with a force that made his chest tighten. Years had passed since his last visit, but the rhythm of the streets remained the same. Auto rickshaws rattled by, vendors shouted their prices, and children darted through narrow lanes with laughter that cut through the noise. Yet beneath the vibrancy, Sundar felt a strange unease. As though the city itself was holding its breath, he traveled quietly, avoiding attention. His old neighborhood was not far from the airport, but as the car drew closer, Sundar's pulse quickened. Memories flooded him walking home from school, with books pressed tightly to his chest. Evenings when he and his brother played cricket with a ball made of rags. Nights when his mother whispered stories of resilience as the power went out again. Every corner held a piece of his soul. Yet time had changed so much that the car finally stopped at the narrow lane where his childhood home still stood. Sundar stepped out slowly, his shoes crunching on gravel. The lane was quieter now, as if the years had drained some of its spirit. New apartments had risen, shops had appeared, but at the far end stood the small weathered house he remembered. The walls were cracked, paint faded, but the sight of it brought tears to his eyes. He walked toward it, each step heavy with the weight of memory. Neighbors peered from windows, curious, but few recognized him. To them, he was just another man. Returning to a forgotten corner of the city, Sundar paused at the rusted gate, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The sound of its creak was the same as when he was a boy. Inside the courtyard, silence greeted him. Weeds grew along the edges, and the once bright walls were dull with age. Sundar reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted key. His heart pounded as he approached the wooden door. For years, this moment had lived only in his imagination. Now, standing here, he wondered if the door would even open. He slid the key into the lock. At first it resisted, stubborn from years of neglect. But with a slow turn, it clicked, and the door creaked open. The air inside was heavy, filled with the scent of dust and time. Sundar stepped into the small living room, his eyes scanning the faded furniture, the broken fan on the ceiling, the cracks in the floor. Everything was still, yet alive with ghosts of the past. He could almost hear his mother's voice calling him to dinner, his father's quiet hum as he read the newspaper, but beneath the warmth of memory, there was something else, an unsettling feeling that the house was not entirely empty. Sundar's steps echoed softly as he moved through the rooms. The kitchen was bare, the bedroom stripped of life, but the walls carried secrets he could not yet see. He finally reached the back room, the one his father had always kept locked. As a boy, Sundar had wondered what was inside, but his father never allowed him to enter. Now, standing before the door, Sundar felt a chill. He tried the handle. It did not budge. His fingers tightened around the key again. Could it open this door too? He placed it into the lock and turned. This time, the door opened smoothly, almost too easily, as if waiting for him all these years. Inside the room, dust floated in thin beams of light, breaking through cracks in the shutters. Against the far wall stood an old wooden trunk. Sundar approached slowly, his breath shallow. The trunk looked untouched, its surface scratched but sturdy. Carved faintly into the wood were letters in Tamil, the same handwriting as his mother's on the old tag dot. Kneeling down, Sundar lifted the lid. It groaned as it opened, releasing a musty scent of papers long forgotten. Inside were bundles of letters tied with string, notebooks filled with careful handwriting, and a small metal box. Sundar's hands shook as he reached for the box. Just then the silence of the house was broken. A floorboard creaked behind him. Sundar froze, turning quickly. At the doorway stood a shadowed figure, watching him. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure said softly, the voice low but sharp. With warning, Sundar's heart pounded. He tried to see the person's face, but the light from the window cast them in darkness. The figure stepped closer, and Sundar could make out the outline of a man older, with a stooped posture yet eyes that gleamed with unsettling intensity. "Who are you?" Sundar asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. The man did not answer directly. Instead, he pointed at the metal box in Sundar's hand. "That does not belong to you anymore. It belongs to those who know the truth." Sundar held the box tighter, his grip firm. "This is my family's house. This is my family's memory," he said quietly. The man's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Memories are dangerous, Mr. Pichai. Some truths are buried for a reason, and if you open that box, you will not be able to close it again. Before Sundar could respond, the man turned abruptly and disappeared into the hallway, his footsteps fading quickly. Sundar rushed after him, but by the time he reached the front courtyard, the lane was empty. Rain drizzled softly, but no one was there. Sundar returned inside, his heart still racing. He placed the box on the trunk, staring at it. Questions swirled in his mind. Who was that man? How did he know about the house, about the key, about the box? And what truth could be so dangerous that strangers would go to such lengths to warn him away? He sat in the dusty room, the shadows of the house pressing in. His hand rested on the metal box, and though fear gnawed at him, he knew he could not turn back. He had opened the door. He had crossed the threshold. With a deep breath, Sundar began to slowly lift the lid of the box. The air inside the small room felt heavier as Sundar's fingers slowly lifted the lid of the metal box. Every sound in the house seemed magnified. Distant dripping of rainwater through a crack in the roof. The soft creak of the trunk beneath him. The faint rustle of papers in the trunk's lower layers. For a moment, Sundar hesitated, almost afraid of what he might find. It was not the fear of danger, but the fear of truth. The kind that reshaped how a person saw their entire life. As the lid opened fully, the dim light revealed its contents. Inside the box lay stacks of folded documents, each worn with age, their edges yellowed. Beneath them rested a small leather-bound diary, cracked with time, but still intact. Sundar's breath caught when he saw it, because the handwriting on the cover was unmistakable. It belonged to his father. His hands trembled as he picked up the diary. He had not seen his father's handwriting in years, and the sight alone sent a wave of emotion through him. Carefully, he opened to the first page. The ink was faded, but the words were still clear. For my sons, so that one day they may know the truth I could never speak aloud. Sundar's chest tightened. He read slowly, each word echoing in his mind. The diary spoke of his father's struggles, long nights working extra shifts, the sacrifices made so his children could study, the debt he had quietly carried to keep the family afloat. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Sundar's eyes widened as he read about something he had never known, a secret project his father had worked on with a small group of engineers decades ago, long before Sundar himself ever dreamed of. Silicon Valley. The diary described an invention, but designed for a new type of circuit, one that was said to be years ahead of its time. His father had believed it could change the future, but he had also believed that powerful people wanted it. Hidden, he wrote about receiving threats, about being warned to stop. Sundar's heart pounded faster as he realized that the diary was not just a collection of personal notes. It was evidence of something buried and forgotten. Beneath the diary, Sundar found blueprints, hand-drawn diagrams of circuits, notes, scribbled in the margins, calculations in his father's careful handwriting. Though old, the designs looked remarkably advanced, far more than Sundar expected from that time. It dawned on him why the stranger in the house had spoken of dangerous truths. These papers were not just family relics. They were the kind of documents that could attract the wrong kind of attention. Even today, Sundar carefully set the papers aside and lifted the final object in the box, an envelope sealed with tape. Across the front, his mother's handwriting read simply, "Open only when you are ready to face the past." His throat tightened as he held the envelope. His mother had given him the key, had written the letter urging him never to forget where he came from. Now, even after her passing, it felt as though she was guiding him again. But the warning on the envelope filled him with both longing and dread. As he sat in a dim room, the sound of rain pressing against the shutters, Sundar felt the pull of two worlds. One was the successful present, the life he had built with humility and resilience, the life where he carried responsibility for millions. The other was this fragile, hidden past, a story his parents had protected but never told. He tore the tape slowly and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. When he unfolded it, his eyes scanned the words written in his mother's careful hand. "If you're reading this, It means the truth has found you. Your father was not just an engineer. He was a man who held a secret that others wanted to bury. We kept it from you so that you could rise without chains. But if the key has brought you back, it means the past is not finished. Protect the papers. Trust only those whose hearts choose kindness, not power. Remember, Sundar, humility is your shield. The truth is your destiny. Sundar's hands tightened around the letter. His mind swirled with questions. Who were the people who wanted this invention hidden? Why had his parents been forced to live in silence about it? And why, after all these years, had someone begun sending him messages, demanding his return? A sudden noise broke his thoughts. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the house, deliberate and heavy. Sundar froze, listening. The lane had been empty earlier, but now he could hear multiple people moving closer. He quickly gathered the papers, the diary, and the letter, placing them back into the box. He shut the lid just as the sound of the front gate creaking open reached his ears. His pulse raced. He stood in the back room, clutching the box tightly, as the wooden door at the front of the house groaned open. Shadows moved inside. The creak of footsteps spread across the old floorboards. Then a voice called out, "Calm but cold. Mr. Pichai, we told you not to open the box. Now you've left us no choice." Sundar's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at the rusted key still in his pocket, then at the metal box in his arms. His parents had trusted him to protect their truth. But now that truth had drawn danger directly to him, and in that moment, as the shadows moved closer through the house, Sundar realized that he was not just holding memories. He was holding something people were willing to fight for. Asterisk the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the old house like a drumbeat of approaching storm. Sundar held the metal box tightly against his chest, his heartbeat quickening with every creak of the wooden floorboards. Shadows flickered against the walls as three figures stepped into the dim light of the living room. They moved with certainty, as if they already knew every corner of the house. The first man stepped forward. He was tall with sharp eyes that never wavered, and his voice carried a cold authority. "We warned you," he said softly, his words almost like a whisper, but heavy with threat. "That box was meant to stay closed. You should have listened." Sundar stood still, his calm exterior masking the storm inside him. "This house belonged to my family. These papers belong to my father. You have no right to tell me to forget them." The man's lips curled into a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Your father was clever, but he was also reckless. He wanted to share something the world was not ready for. People like him, people who think truth is harmless, they end up silenced. We make sure of that then, and we will make sure of it now." Sundar's breath caught. The meaning of the words was clear. His father had not just been threatened, he had been forced into silence. His dream buried by those who feared its power. Another figure stepped closer, a woman whose voice carried both warning and pity. "Mr. Pichai, you are not like your father. You have power now, far greater than he ever had. You control information, you shape how the world thinks. You could use that to protect yourself. But if you choose the path of truth, you will lose everything." The weight of her words pressed down on him, but Sundar's gaze hardened. He thought of his mother's letter, her reminder that humility was his shield and truth his destiny. He thought of his father's diary, filled with sacrifices and dreams that had been hidden for decades. And he realized that the decision before him was not about protecting himself, it was about honoring the legacy of the people who had given him everything. He lifted his chin, his voice steady. "My father taught me that no invention is dangerous when it is guided by kindness. The danger comes only from those who fear it." The man's expression darkened. "Then you leave us no choice." He nodded, and the other two figures began to move forward, their steps slow but threatening. Before they could reach him, the sound of voices rose from outside. Neighbors, hearing the commotion, had gathered near the gate. A child's voice called out, "Who's in the old Pichai house?" Another voice answered, "Someone is there, maybe trouble." Lanterns and phone lights began to flicker outside the window, casting new beams of light into the house. The intruders froze, realizing the risk of being exposed. The tall man glared at Sundar one last time. "This isn't over," he hissed. Then, as quickly as they had entered, the three figures slipped out the back door. Disappearing into the rain-soaked night, the house fell silent again, but the silence was different now. Sundar stood in the middle of the room, breathing deeply, the box still in his arms. He could feel the weight of everything inside, the diary, the blueprints, the letter. They were no longer just family keepsakes. They were proof of a story. Buried by fear, a story that still had power to change the world. He sat slowly on the trunk, his hands resting on the box. For a long moment, he let the quiet wash over him. Then, in the stillness, his memories came back sharper than ever. His father's gentle smile, his mother's whispered advice, the nights of hunger, the days of resilience, the unshakable love. That had carried him from these very walls to the highest stage in the world. Sundar whispered softly, almost as if speaking to them. "I will not let your truth be lost." The next morning, he returned to the house with trusted people from his team, men and women he knew valued compassion above ambition. Together, they carefully documented every page, every blueprint, every letter. Sundar explained nothing about power or profit. He told them only that this work was to be preserved with honesty, shared only in ways that helped humanity and never exploited it. And as the sun rose over Chennai, Sundar stood at the gate of his childhood home. He looked at the rusted key in his hand, the very key his mother had pressed into his palm when he left for America. It had unlocked more than a door. It had unlocked a hidden history, a painful truth, and a legacy of resilience that now rested. With him, tears welled in his eyes, but they were not of sorrow. They were of gratitude. He whispered to himself, "The past will not stay hidden, but it will no longer stay buried in fear. It will live with kindness." With that, he turned and walked down the lane. The neighbors watched quietly, some whispering his name, others simply nodding in respect. The boy who once ran barefoot on these streets had returned not as a man of power, but as a son carrying his family's truth. And though shadows still lingered, though those who feared the truth had promised to return, Sundar's steps were steady. Because he knew that humility and kindness, the very lessons his parents had lived by, were stronger than any threat. Asterisk.